Late November 1944. The Hurtgen Forest. The air itself is a razor. It does not just carry the cold, it is the cold. It finds the gaps in the thin wool of a Landseer's greatcoat, it settles into the damp leather of his boots, and it lives in his lungs. The trees are black, shattered skeletons, their branches snapped by artillery. The ground is a frozen, churned mud, concealing minds, bodies, and the last vestiges of hope. For the German soldier huddled in a foxhole that is more grave than shelter, the world has shrunk to this. The sound of his own shivering, the distant impersonal crack of an American M1 Garand, and the gnawing, acidic emptiness in his stomach. This is the paradox of the German front line in the winter of 1944. The soldier does not fear the enemy's bullet nearly as much as he fears the failure of his own supply line. His superiors have promised him victory, have assured him of his racial superiority, but they cannot seem to find him a potato. He sees the American planes, silver bombers flying in untouchable formations, and he sees the American artillery, which fires shells as if they are limitless. And then he looks at his own rations, a sliver of black bread, rigid with frost, and a thin, greasy soup. He has been told he is the master of the world, but he is starving. His war is not about the Führer anymore. It is not about Lebensraum. It is about surviving the next artillery barrage and the quiet, desperate hope of finding a discarded American K ration. And then it happens. A sudden rush of olive-drab uniforms, the sharp, terrifying command, "Hands up, Hände hoch!" and the cold, final press of a rifle barrel. Capture. For this soldier, this is the expected end. His propaganda has prepared him for this moment. The Americans, he has been told, are decadent. They are gangsters, criminals, and mongrels. They will take his watch, his boots, and then they will put a bullet in his head. Or worse. He has seen what his own side has done to prisoners on the Eastern Front. He expects no mercy, because his worldview has no place for it. He raises his hands, his body trembling from cold and fear. He feels the rough grip of a GI pulling him from the hole. He shuts his eyes, waiting for the blow, the shot, the end. Instead, he hears a new sound, a metallic click. He flinches, but there is no impact. He opens his eyes. The American soldier, a boy half his age with weary eyes, is holding out a small, green-packaged cigarette. A lucky strike. The German soldier stares, uncomprehending. This is not in the script. This is not the brutal gangster he was promised. He hesitates. The American sighs, pushes the cigarette into the German's pocket, and points a different object at him. A small, brown, wax-covered box. A K-ration. The German soldier takes it. His hands are so numb he can barely hold it. He opens it. Inside he finds biscuits, a small tin of processed cheese, a chocolate bar. He looks at the chocolate. It is real. He has not seen real chocolate in 3 years. This is the first fracture in his reality, the first, quiet, impossible contradiction. He expected a bullet. He was given a meal. This single, simple act of kindness is more disorienting, more psychologically shattering than the entire artillery bombardment that preceded it. His indoctrination told him to expect an executioner. His reality has just handed him dessert. If you think the story of war is only told in battle plans and casualty lists, you are missing the most powerful weapon. What happened after the surrender, in the quiet processing camps and on the long journey into captivity, would become one of the most effective and least understood operations of the entire conflict. It was not about winning the war. That was already becoming a mathematical certainty. It was about winning the peace, and it began not with a lecture, but with a full stomach. As 1944 bled into 1945, the German Wehrmacht was not just being defeated, it was disintegrating. In the West, entire divisions were collapsing, surrendering en masse. First by the thousand, then by the tens of thousands, and finally by the hundreds of thousands. The Battle of the Bulge had been Hitler's last, ruinous gamble. It failed, and in its wake, the German army was a hollowed-out shell. This presented the Allies, and specifically the Americans, with a logistical and moral problem of unprecedented scale. What to do with millions of defeated, starving, and ideologically poisoned men? The prevailing logic, born of 4 years of brutal warfare, leaned toward punishment. Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau, Jr., had already proposed a plan that would have deindustrialized Germany, turning it into a permanent agrarian pasture. Many in the American public, fed a steady diet of newsreels showing German atrocities and the skeletal survivors of the concentration camps, were in no mood for mercy. The cry was for vengeance, but a different logic was operating within the U.S. War Department, specifically in the office of the Provost Marshal General. This was not a logic of emotion, but of cold, long-term strategy. The men behind this policy, figures like Major General Alan Gullion and his successor, Blackshear M. Bryan, were not naive idealists. They were pragmatists. They understood something that the politicians of vengeance did not. They understood that this war would end. And when it did, 2 things would be true. First, Germany would be the new frontier of a different conflict, the one brewing with their temporary ally, the Soviet Union. Second, the millions of men they now held in their custody were not just prisoners. They were the future. They were the men who would have to go back and rebuild their shattered country. They would be the foremen, the farmers, the police officers, the teachers. And they would either rebuild Germany as a bitter, resentful nation, ripe for the next demagogue, or they could rebuild it as something new, a stable, democratic, and Western-facing ally. The decision was made, against significant political pressure, to adhere strictly to the 1929 Geneva Convention, and then to go beyond it. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. You cannot deprogram a mind by force. You cannot argue a man out of an ideology he has held for a decade, but you can show him a better way. The mechanism of this grand strategic pivot was not a gun. It was not a propaganda leaflet. It was a loaf of white bread. The journey for the captured Lancer was a study in inverted expectations. From the front, he was marched to a collecting point. Here the first surprise, a delousing station, hot showers. His lice-ridden, filthy uniform was taken and boiled or replaced. He was dusted with DDT powder. This was not comfort, it was sanitation. But for a man who had lived in filth for months, it was a resurrection. Then the first real meal at a processing center. He lined up expecting the same watery cabbage soup that had been his lot for a warning. The man in front of him, a fellow prisoner, was handed a metal tray. The German soldier watched. On the tray was a heap of steaming stew, thick with meat and vegetables. There were 2 slices of bread. Not the coarse, sawdust-filled black Kriegsbrot, but white bread. Soft, pure, and impossibly decadent. And at the end of the line, a ladle was dipped into a large vat, and a tin cup was filled with a dark, steaming liquid. The aroma hit him. It was unmistakable, it was real coffee. Coffee, for the average German, was a memory. The Reich ran on ersatz, a bitter, roasted barley sludge. Real coffee beans were a luxury reserved for the highest ESETs. Yet here, in a muddy field in France, the lowest form of life, a prisoner of war, was being handed a cup of it. Many soldiers, documented in diaries and post-war interviews, would later recall this moment. Some wept. Some were suspicious, believing the food must be poisoned. It was a lie. A trick. But the hunger was stronger than the suspicion. They ate. And with each bite, the foundations of their world began to crack. The propaganda of Joseph Goebbels had been built on a dual promise: the superiority of the German Volk and the grotesque, subhuman nature of the enemy. The Americans, in particular, were portrayed as a degenerate, chaotic nation of jazz-obsessed mongrels, incapable of organization and only powerful because of their brute material weight. But what the German POW saw now contradicted everything. He saw the organization, the endless columns of trucks, the efficiency of the processing, the casual, almost careless abundance. The Americans were not just winning, they were winning effortlessly, and they were sharing the spoils of that victory with their defeated enemies. The greatest shock was yet to come. For roughly 400,000 German prisoners, the camps in war-torn France were only a temporary stop. They were slated for transport to the United States. They were marched onto Liberty ships, the same vessels that had carried the tanks and bullets to destroy their armies. They expected to be packed into the holds like cattle, a mirror of the death transports their own regime had perfected. Instead, they were given bunks. They were assigned duties. And they were fed 3 meals a day. On the ocean, under the guard of the U.S. Navy, they ate bacon, they ate eggs, they ate butter and jam. They gained weight. They looked out at the endless gray Atlantic, and for the first time, the war felt truly, irrevocably over. When they arrived in America, in ports like New York or Newport News, Virginia, the illusion was complete. They were put on trains. And here, the psychological operation reached its peak. On these trains, they were guarded by American soldiers, and as the trains rolled south and west to the new camps being built in Texas, Arizona, Mississippi, and across the nation, something incredible happened. The guards, many of whom had family fighting in Europe, began to interact with the prisoners. They were not supposed to, but they did. They shared cigarettes. They taught them a few words of English, and most importantly, the prisoners were given the same food as their guards. Imagine the scene. A German NCO, who a month ago was in a foxhole in the Ardennes, is now sitting on a train crossing Mississippi. He is handed a boxed lunch. Inside a sandwich, fruit, a piece of pie, and a Coca-Cola. He drinks it. It is sweet, strange, and utterly symbolic of the world he was told was weak and decadent. He looks out the window and he does not see a nation collapsing, as his leaders had promised. He sees towns, farms, cars on the roads. He sees a nation utterly untouched by the war it was so decisively winning. This was the core of the genius. It was a deception of inverted propaganda. Goebbels had built an empire on lies. The Americans were dismantling it with the truth. The camps themselves were another shock. In places like Camp Hearn in Texas or Camp Clinton in Mississippi, the Germans found themselves in purpose-built compounds that were, by the standards of the day, remarkably humane. They were modeled on U.S. Army bases. The barracks were clean. There was hot water. There were sports fields. Foosball became an obsession. The U.S. Army, citing the Geneva Convention, mandated a specific caloric intake for prisoners, identical to that prescribed for American soldiers in garrison. This policy became a source of intense public controversy. American civilians were living under strict rationing. Meat, sugar, coffee, and gasoline were all precious, limited commodities. And newspapers began to run outraged editorials. Why are we feeding Nazi prisoners steak and ice cream, while our wives are using ration stamps for butter? The political pressure on the War Department was immense. But the strategists held firm. They knew this was not about food. It was about investment. The food was the key that unlocked the mind. And once the mind was unlocked, the real work began. This was the Special Projects Division, the formal re-education program. It was perhaps the most ambitious and successful psychological operation in modern history. The Americans understood that lecturing prisoners on the evils of Nazism would fail. It would be seen as obvious, crude propaganda. Instead, they took a different approach. They used the Socratic method on a mass scale. They gave the prisoners the tools to deprogram themselves, First, they carefully segregated the prisoners. The hardcore, unshakable Nazis were separated from the apolitical and from the growing number of anti-Nazis. This broke the internal grip of fear and intimidation that Gestapo-like prisoners held over the camps. Then, they introduced information. They provided access to American magazines, Life, Time, the Saturday Evening Post. The prisoners, who had been fed a diet of state-controlled media, were suddenly seeing a vibrant, diverse, and complicated vision of their enemy. They saw photographs of American families, of towering cities, of vast mechanized farms. It was a portrait of a nation that was not just powerful, but confident. They were allowed to publish their own camp newspapers. The most famous was Der Ruf, The Call, edited by a group of intellectual anti-Nazi prisoners. It was printed and distributed by the U.S. Army. In its pages, German writers, philosophers, and soldiers debated, for the first time, what had happened to their country. They began to ask the forbidden questions. How did we let this happen? What is our responsibility? What comes after? And then came the masterstroke: education. The camps became, in effect, the largest university system in the world. Prisoners with academic backgrounds were recruited to teach. They offered courses in English, mathematics, engineering, history, and agriculture. But they also offered courses in American civics, in democracy. They screened American films, not just war films, but Frank Capra movies. Films about the common man, about the struggle for justice, about the simple, radical idea that the state serves the people, not the other way around. For the German POW, the emotional contrast was absolute. His expectation, drilled into him by 12 years of indoctrination, was that he was a member of the Herrenvolk, the master race, destined to rule. His reality was that his glorious Third Reich, which was supposed to last 1,000 years, had left him to starve in a forest, while the inferior enemy had saved him, cleaned him, and was now offering him an education and a future. This contradiction was the mechanism of transformation. The kindness was not random. It was a precise, psychological tool. The white bread, the hot coffee, the Lucky Strike cigarette. These were the symbolic elements that unraveled an ideology. They were the tangible proof that everything he had been told was a lie. The symbol, repeated every day, 3 times a day, was the food. It was the quiet anthem of American abundance. It said, more clearly than any lecture, our system works. Our system is strong. Our system has so much it can afford to be kind to its defeated foe. The climax of this story is not a battle. It is a quiet moment of revelation, repeated in the minds of hundreds of thousands of men. It is the moment a German soldier, his stomach full, his mind processing a lecture on the U.S. Constitution, receives his first letter from home in months. He reads about the reality in Germany, the bombed-out cities, the starvation, the millions of refugees fleeing the advance of the Red Army. He reads stories of the mass rapes, the plunder, the systematic brutality being inflicted on the German populace in the East. And he looks around his prison. He sees a baseball game in progress. He smells the coffee brewing in the canteen. He knows that tonight he will sleep in a clean bed, safe from bombs and starvation. In that moment, he knows. He knows who truly betrayed him. It was not the American GI who captured him. It was the Führer who abandoned him. The proof of this strategy came in the years after the war. From 1946 to 1947, the prisoners were repatriated. They returned to a land that was not even a country. It was Zone 1, 2, 3, and 4. It was the Stunde Null, the 0 hour. A nation of rubble and of ghosts. And these men, the Americans, as they were sometimes called by their starving countrymen, were different. They were healthier. They were more optimistic, and they were profoundly, deeply changed. They brought back not just their few possessions, but ideas. They brought back knowledge of modern agricultural techniques, of engineering, of democratic process. They became the bedrock of the Wirtschaftswunder, the West German economic miracle. The editors of Der Ruf went home and founded Gruppe 47, the most important literary movement of post-war Germany. The scholars, the engineers, the foremen, they were the ones who had seen firsthand that the Nazi way was a dead end, and that the American way, while not perfect, was a path forward. They became the most reliable, potent anti-communist and anti-fascist bulwark in Central Europe. The strategy had worked. The investment in coffee and white bread had paid a dividend that would secure the peace for 50 years. We returned to the image of the forest, the cold, shattered trees, the starving soldier in his hole. What he thought was the end was, in fact, the beginning. He was not just captured in that forest. He was, in a very real way, saved. His body was saved from the cold. His mind was saved from the poison. The true prison was not the one in Texas, surrounded by wire. The true prison was the one he had carried in his mind, built by propaganda and sealed by fear. And the key that opened it was never a gun. It was never a threat. It was the most unexpected and most profoundly human weapon of all, a simple act of kindness delivered at the point of total defeat. What looked like surrender was, in truth, liberation, and in that simple meal an empire of hate was quietly, personally, and permanently disarmed. The battle for territory ends with a ceasefire. The battle for the mind never does. If this story of an enemy's kindness resonated, there is another, darker side to this coin. The story of what happened to the other German prisoners on the other front. And it is a chilling reminder of what happens when humanity is forgotten.